post-luncheon session continues the geopolitical reflection begun with David Delyden's transmission and then continued with Uji's report from the vantage point of Africa. We continue this perspective this afternoon and turn our attention to the Far East, to China, and this will be done courtesy of Stephen Mosher's audio and visual presentation of his experiences there. Now, Stephen Mosher is an American social scientist, the first American social scientist permitted to conduct field research in China since the Communist Revolution. He was sent there by President Carter in the late 1970s. And his account formed the basis of his best-selling book, Broken Earth. Stephen Mosher is president of the Population Research Institute. So we are now going to enjoy the audio-visual presentation of his time in China.
Since the time of Marco Polo, images of China's teeming multitudes have been scratched onto Western minds. While the wandering Venetian Marco Polo found much to admire in China, the sheer number of Chinese left him astounded. Skeptical contemporaries of Polo gave him the mocking title Il Milione, or the Million, for the frequency that he used this superlative to describe the Chinese population. But Marco Polo was, in this respect, a perfectly reliable witness. The world had never seen a more populous empire than 13th century Song dynasty. It had a population of about 110 million, occupying a continent-sized territory with a standing army of 1 million. It dwarfed contemporary Western states in every respect. China's large population was seen as an indispensable element of its national greatness and its imperial power. But there's another darker Western perception of China's population, dating back to the Mongol hordes of the non-Chinese Genghis Khan. This perception sees the Chinese masses as a faceless, impenetrable, overwhelming mass, irresistible once loosed, and a mass, it might be added, that was thought to be feverishly multiplying. This, however, was never true. The population growth rate was slow and steady during periods of dynastic rise, and it would fall precipitously when China fell into chaos and dynastic ruin. But in 1979, the Chinese government decided to make China's population an issue. They decided to blame Chinese continuing poverty on too many babies. And so, for the last 30 years, the Chinese people have suffered under the brutal one-child policy.
The claim that there is reproductive freedom in China is patently absurd. There isn't any freedom of choice, freedom of how or when to have children in the entire country. The government takes a very active and administrative role in planning families. That one-child policy is strictly in effect, straight down to the localist of levels. The attitudes of the Chinese government haven't changed. There's been no shift towards a greater awareness of human rights.
In 2001, the Population Research Institute carried out a major investigation in China. Our investigator, a paralegal named Josephine Guy, found that China's one-child policy had not improved since the late 1970s. In fact, it had gotten far, far worse.
Every person we talked to had a story. I didn't have one incident where I approached someone about the subject matter for which we were conducting the investigation that didn't have some story of coercion.
Even more disturbingly, Josephine found that the Chinese government was not only actively working to lower population numbers by force, but they were doing it with the help of a United Nations agency, an agency which goes by the name of the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, or UNFPA. PRI had grown concerned about UNFPA activities in China when that agency began carrying out an extensive model county, quote-unquote, campaign in mainland China. This campaign, extending over more than 30 counties, was supposed to work with the Chinese government to set up a healthcare standard that the rest of the country could follow. The UNFPA claimed that in these counties the one-child policy had been relaxed, or even virtually reversed. According to UNFPA documents, the UNFPA says that all of the family planning programs in its model counties are, quote, fully voluntary, end of quote, and that there is no coercion. In these counties, the UNFPA goes on, it has introduced a client-centered, quality of care-oriented approach to reproductive health care. In other words, in those counties, the UNFPA claims that coercion no longer exists. Josephine carried out interviews within a few miles of the UNFPA county office, in a county where the UNFPA insists that coercion does not exist.
In a region of China, in a county where UNFPA claims coercion does not exist, forced sterilization, forced abortion, jackhammer campaigns.
If you violate the population control regulations by having too many children, what happens to you?
When I had my children, things are not as strict. Right now, things are very, very strict.
What happens to you if you give birth to another child?
You want to have another child? You think it's that easy to give birth?
Would someone come to your house and take you in by force for an abortion?
Yes, but they don't need to use force. They simply require you to go.
And if you don't go?
They require you to go, and you don't go?
If you say you don't want to go?
What reason could you give? Giving birth to an extra child is difficult. Very, very difficult to have a child.
Josephine reported that the retribution for having illegal children consisted of the destruction of homes, the imprisonment of families, and the blacklisting of children, who could then no longer qualify for government benefits.
I ran into forced abortion. A young lady in a hospital was 18 or 19 years old. The law mandates that you can only marry at 23, and she'd become pregnant outside of wedlock. And she was not authorized by the government to have a baby, so she was forced into the hospital, and her baby was taken away. We found an older man. He began to tell us about his daughter-in-law who had become pregnant, and with the technology that we have today, she knew it was a boy, and she was not willing to abort her baby boy. So she took it upon herself to leave her village and go into hiding into another village. The government came in with jackhammers and I believe destroyed 2, maybe even 3 homes of her in-laws and imprisoned her entire family.
They arrested 6 people in my mother-in-law's family and destroyed 3 homes. They arrested them all.
When they couldn't find the woman, they attacked her home and the homes of her relatives with jackhammers. Her father-in-law describes the damage.
Look at this. All of the doors and windows destroyed. Here's the big hole that they knocked in the wall. It took 40 bags of cement to repair the holes.
When I first went there, I remember thinking to myself, I thought it was going to be quite an undertaking. So the first time I walked into a village, I found it to be quite the opposite. I approached someone, there was a story. We approached another group of people, there was another story. That's how prevalent it is. And I thought it would be like picking a needle out of a haystack, and it wasn't.
Even after Josephine's visit, there were those who continued to insist that the UNFPA was a force for good in the Chinese counties where it operated, and that the Chinese one-child policy had been significantly relaxed. None of this is true.
Well, I would say they're somewhere out in another planet because it's just not so. I mean, I was on the ground. They were very forthcoming about the events. I have no reason to believe they would falsify that information. They cried when they told their story. They were very emotional. They were very angry. It's just not true. They can say whatever they want, but it's just not true. I was there. We talked to them.
I was in the south of China, near Hong Kong, in the Guangdong province and in Guangxi, in 3 counties, looking for instances of the one-child policy, how it was enforced, where it was enforced equally. I was able to talk to a lot of villagers and people in the rural areas in these places. What I found on my trip was completely consistent with what Josephine Guy and all the other PRI investigators found in their previous investigations. That is to say, the Chinese one-child policy or family planning policy was in full swing and was just as coercive as ever before. All you have to do is walk into a county, walk into a village, and you can see posted how many people can have children, what the circumstances are. You can see signs proclaiming the one-child policy everywhere you look. In fact, we went to this one area where on each of the lampposts on the street was a sign proclaiming the one-child policy, as far as we could see, just stretching into the horizon. The propaganda is very ham-handed. It's really pretty over the top. There's no even attempt to pretend that healthcare or reproductive policy has gotten any less administrative, any more voluntary, any more centered on health rather than population control. The first Chinese location that my expedition visited was Suhui County, which is actually the same county that Josephine Guy visited in 2001. Incidentally, I even saw the same government building where Josephine discovered that the Chinese family planning officials shared an office with a UNFPA representative. This county was where we saw, far and away, the most signs, and the most visible forms of the one-child policy. Even though it was clear that the policy was there, the Chinese were incredibly paranoid about talking openly about it. Even though the government didn't seem to be involved in any immediate crackdown, we still found plenty of people who told us that family planning was strict and coercive.
按照政策的话是超生的嘛，有没有问题？
以前我们那里还是很松的，很放松。现在对啊，5万块，差不多2年工作才能还那个。我们那时候都可以，不过我们是以前是那个乡下嘛，都是一条村这样给的，不是个人给的，所以很多人都超生是这样回事。
什么叫一个村给的？
一个村乡下呢，那里以前很穷嘛，一个人叫你交几万块，交不可能交得来，它是一条村，不管你生不生，照样收，这样所以很多人都你不生也要收钱，生了也是一样，不如超生一个这样。
Our next stop was Lipu County in the Guangxi province, where we came across far worse cases of coercion.
如果没钱交罚款怎么样？我哋交罚款。出價啦！抽價啦！嗱，這個可以八。
Fines, by far, were the most common form of enforcing the one-child policy. But the most disturbing thing we found in Lipu by far was an account by a gentleman who seemed to be a lower-level communist official. He told us that in certain situations, if one had quote-unquote illegal children and refused to pay the fine, they risked actually having their children stolen from them and handed off to someone else by the government.
你现在就是拿不出钱，把你的生个小孩抱你去让给别个。
He apparently thought better of telling us this, because immediately afterward he got nervous and put a call in to the local authorities, alerting them to our presence. We of course excused ourselves and got quickly on our way again. In Long'an, we visited some very, very impoverished areas, which incredibly were still being saddled with tremendous fines. In fact, one very poor woman told us of how she and her husband had taken out a 10-year loan simply to pay the 25,000 renminbi fine on their 2 illegal daughters, a sort of child mortgage.
今天有一个几千块啊，几千啊，几百都没有啊，去打工啊嘛。现在可以生几个孩子啊？现在我啊，3个。罚款啊？是啊。罚多少钱？2万5。2万5。哦。第3个孩子犯了2万5。是啊。哦。那房子还没有盖。那么多钱交不出来怎么办？那就找这个人家了嘛，用10年来还了嘛，一点一点的还了嘛。啊，那你家要到城里面打工呢，才有钱啊？是啊，我老公去打工啊。
According to her, her husband had been forced to work in the city to support her family and their debt. We also ran into a minority woman who told us about coercive sterilizations, saying that the consequences of having a 3rd child would be that the government would, quote, take measures to sterilize you, end quote. It was clear that the operation would not be voluntary, even though she hastened to add that many people now choose to preempt the government by opting to get the operation themselves.
不是，你家就一个孩子啊？我读书了。读书了，都读书了。我2个孩子。2个女儿。1个女儿1个。不可以再生一个吗？哦，不生了，不允许，政策不允许呢。那会不会采取一些措施，就是说来说节育啊？采取呢？那是生啊，反正你不什么，人家这样自愿的也是自愿的，你生多也是养不起的。我说你要是人家不来抓你去，你也自愿去做，哪有什么什么？
However, it was in this county that we found the most explicit evidence of coercion in the form of a prominently posted sign in the middle of a village, which very clearly laid out the birth policy and what was to be done to those who violated it. Those who illegally gave birth were to be assessed fines in multiples of their yearly income, fines that in the United States would amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Americans and the rest of the West need to realize that in order to positively affect women in China, a strong stand needs to be taken against the one-child policy everywhere. It needs to be a prerequisite for aid from the West. There's no other way, because the Chinese policy is so ingrained and everyone is so accustomed to it that there needs to be a hard stand taken against it for any kind of improvement to be made.
As an eyewitness to forced abortions in China, to forced sterilizations, to the abandonment unto death of baby girls, the Chinese government has been eager to keep me outside of the country. But recently, through what I can only call divine providence, I was able to return and see for myself what was happening in the countryside vis-a-vis the one-child policy. Colin and Josephine had spent time in South China looking for and finding evidence of coercion. Now it was time to look at other parts of the country. My own investigation focused on counties in northern China where the UN Population Fund claims to be in charge of the family planning program, and where they also claim that there are no violations. My first stop was a county in northern China, which is home to many people of Manchu descent. The Manchus are the minority which conquered and ruled China under the Qing dynasty for 300 years. The Chinese government itself claims that minorities like the Manchus and the Uyghurs in the far west and the Tibetans on the Tibetan plateau are exempt from the one-child policy, that they are in fact free to have 2 and even 3 children. We found out when I visited with Manchus that this wasn't so.
平常是2-3个小孩子就，现在这儿是对，自愿不生不多生。
第3个就挨罚了。
罚了，罚款。
3个就拿钱了。
不实现计划生育了吗？多了就不行了。
那你有一个儿子，
一个儿子。
Think about what happens to a small minority group when the government of China imposes a one-child policy on it. Naturally, its numbers shrink over time. This is ultimately a recipe for genocide. The UN Population Fund claims that childbearing quotas have been lifted in the villages where it runs the family planning program. This turns out not to be true as well.
上在全村有没有这种配额制度？
我没听清。
配额就是说，政府有没有规定？你们这儿
有规定。
新房只能今年2009年只能有10个小孩子。
对。
在全村要超过的话就不上。
有
还有啊。
那还是在计划内的吧？就是一对妇女，好比说，除了有新结婚的，再有2胎的，能占好，就假如说10个，你要超出这，再就多生一个11个，就是村里就。
全村要罚，
就不是村干部村里这。
So there you have it. If even one couple has an illegal overquota child, the whole village is fined. Imagine the kinds of social pressures that are brought to bear on couples who violate this rule.
因为我好几年没有来，那你有几个孩子？
我2个小儿子。
2个哈。多大？
大的23了，小的15。
还在家里啊？
上学呢，小的。
那你怎么可以生2个吗？不是有这个一胎化政策吗？
这样农村吧，一般都是2孩。
可以，在农村可以生，没有罚款啊。15岁都间隔8年。
4、5岁，最什么也得5岁间隔。那就是。
那你生的第2个，他们怎么跟你说不准生第3个？
对，就是现在也没有生第3个的。
In China today, women are not free to choose the timing of their childbearing. Forced sterilizations and forced abortions continue to occur, and targets and quotas for childbearing are very much in place. All of the claims made by the UN Population Fund that these abuses no longer exist are false. 30 years after the beginning of the one-child policy, the face of China has grown old. 3 decades ago, China abounded in children. Today, the children are largely gone. The courtyards are deserted. The fines, the quotas, and the forced abortions have taken a huge toll. Most of the children you do encounter are boys. Many, many little girls in China have been victims of infanticide or sex-selective abortion. This baby girl was a rescue, abandoned by the side of the road and left to die, but she may not survive. Yet there are some places in China where children, both boys and girls, still abound. We visited a number of villages in China which have been Catholic for centuries. And in these villages, it is not uncommon for families to have 5 or more children. How did they manage to escape the dragnet? We interviewed one man who had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. He told us a harrowing story of how they had tried several times to hunt down his wife when she was pregnant.
计划生育就是说强制性的，共产党有强制性。对，就像前几年，就像我们这个生的孩子比较多的，到处跑，到处人家就来抓你，抓了你就给你做手术。
抓了你就给你堕胎。那你太太有没有被抓？
没有，我们就一直躲。
Since everyone in his village is Catholic, they sounded the alarm when the officials appeared, and all the pregnant women, including his wife, scurried into hiding. Where Catholics are in the minority, they are not so fortunate.
在教友少的村庄，教友就这样
就问题大了。
就扛不住它了。
The one-child policy continues to be very much in place today, 30 years after I first discovered it. The people of China continue to suffer as a result of this brutal campaign. Little girls especially are targeted and victimized by the tens of millions. The United Nations Population Fund continues to be active in China to defend and justify the Chinese government's attack on its own people. It is past time for the United States to once again cut off funding to this rogue UN agency, once and for all.